Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This memorial is a little different. Usually the memorials we do are for people who served in this body a decade or two ago. This one is a little closer to home. In fact, for those of you who are new to the body, just last year, Mark sat right where Senator Semmelroth sits. He served one term in the House and 2 terms in the Senate, and he would have continued to grace these halls, but he had an illness. Wasn't sure how it was progressing, but he felt that it was time for him to retire, and so he didn't run again when we had the opportunity to do that, to put our names in March. I actually found out he wasn't running. At the same time, everybody else found out. We were on a chamber call, an early morning chamber call. I still had sleep in my eyes. Mark went first because he had to get into JFAC, and he announced to our chamber group that he wouldn't be running and that I would be running in his place. That was news to me that morning. And so what followed was one of the greatest acting events of my life, where I had to pretend like I knew all along that was the plan, and that I was prepared to take the job. And I can't remember what I said. All I knew is this is typical Mark. He liked to mess with people. While his illness was serious, his passing was certainly not expected. So it was a shock to our community and also a very deep loss. I want to just introduce some of his family members. Many of you know his wife, Eva, because she would substitute, since she would be over here with Mark, she'd substitute for different members on the House side and maybe even in this body. Eva is wonderful. She couldn't be here today. She had a knee replacement recently, and so I called her this morning just to visit with her. And I frankly feel like if you're going to honor somebody like Mark, you got to honor his spouse, because she is very definitely part of who he was as a person and why he was the way he was. Eva served on our city council for many years in Pocatello, and she was appointed to finish Mark's term after he passed away in July. She's a wonderful human, and just a good person to know. She's also a political animal. Probably as good as anybody in this body, I think. After we talked about the mechanics and what was going on with Memorial, she immediately turned to politics and what was being discussed in the legislature, what bills were coming up. As always, her points were well-reasoned and timely. She said she just couldn't help herself. I told her there was treatment for this condition she has, where she has to talk about politics all the time. And so we're working on an intervention later. But she does wish she could be here, and she sends her love. Mark has family members here, and I want to just introduce them briefly. Some family members weren't able to make it, but Stephanie is one of his daughters, and Jennifer. And then Alex is a grandson. And I had the chance, when we did the remembrance for Mark in Pocatello, Alex delivered some remarks, and he is a phenomenal and gifted speaker. He's going to follow, I think, in his granddad's footsteps. I also got to know Jennifer quite well. We sat next to each other at one of the events at a dinner, and just got along instantly. Prompted Eva to suggest that I could join their family and be the older brother, and I could see in Jennifer's eyes she didn't think that was too cool, because she's like, yeah, very much older brother. It's certainly not somebody who comes from the same gene pool as the Nyes, because we're not as attractive in the Ruchti family, but they are just a great family. And the Nyes very much appreciate everybody who came over to celebrate Mark's life. The governor came over, many members of this body came over, and I think it was a good example to our community that despite what they read in the paper and despite what they hear on the news, that we care about one another and that we recognize that we all bring important things to the table despite party affiliation, despite differences of opinion. Mark has other friends that have come to share the celebration. Park and Sharon Price, who are stalwarts of our community in eastern Idaho, and Dick Bowen, I think, was hoping to be here. Dick and Elizabeth, his daughter. Dick Bowen was a former Idaho State University president for many years. His daughter, Elizabeth, is one of the LSO bill drafters. And Elizabeth and Jennifer, one of Mark's daughters, used to run around in high school and probably kept Pocatello Police Department quite busy, I suspect. Tom and Bessie Katzlamides were hoping to be here to celebrate Mark's life with us today. Let me just, oh, there they are, there. Let me just say a few things about Mark so you get a little flavor of who he was as a person. He was born in New York City on August 3rd, 1945, but he was raised in Pocatello. He had lifelong friends who were still in grade school from grade school that he knew and would visit with throughout our community. After graduation from Pocatello High School, where he served as the student body president, he boarded a train in 1963 and headed to Cambridge, Massachusetts. There he attended Harvard University on a scholarship and graduated in 1967. He then returned to Idaho to go to law school at the University of Idaho Law School, and in 1974 earned his Juris Doctorate from that institution. He then returned to Pocatello, where he joined the law firm of Racine, Huntley, and Olson. At the time, probably the biggest law firm in eastern and southeast Idaho. He soon became a named partner in the firm, which later became known as Racine, Olson, Nye, and Budge, and now the Racine Olson firm. He served on the Board of Governors of the American Bar Association. He was a past president of the Idaho Bar Association, our local 6th District Bar Association. He was president of the Association of Defense Counsel and a member of the American Board of Trial Advocates, as well as a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and a member of the Idaho Trial Lawyers Association. As Mark began to wind down his 40-year career, it was no surprise to anybody that he would end up in this body, because this was something he had always wanted to do. And I know that from many conversations with Mark, that he loved being in the legislature. He loved serving in the legislature. He fought endlessly to make a difference for the people of Idaho while here. He focused on education, growing the economy, and really just being a voice for all Idahoans. Just a couple other things that I thought were interesting about Mark. He loved playing baseball when he was younger, even played a little when he was at Harvard, enjoyed the outdoors, skiing, golf. He loved to read about Idaho history, biographies, politics, and loved spending time with friends, as is evidenced by those who have shown up here today to celebrate his life. I first met Mark over 20 years ago in a job interview. I'd gone around and met all the other partners, everybody else at the Racine firm, and as I headed to Mark's office, because he was the managing partner, I was told, go in there and let him know what you want. And so I walked in to tell him what I believed I was worth. I found out that was not what I was worth. The key, Alex, when you go in for a job, you tell them what you are worth. And I believed I was worth more than I really was. So I didn't get that job, but this is what I found out. Mark was a great guy, and we continued, my law partner and I, whether it was on the same side or opposite sides of the table, we would do work with Mark. When we were up against him, we knew we had a real challenge on our hands. His dry wit and his negotiation skills went well together. And this is why. When you negotiate, as many of you know, but certainly in the law, the key is you're trying to find out what the other side wants without letting them know what you want. Mark's dry wit kept you on your toes and the back of your heels often because you didn't know what he meant by what he was saying. And so I can't tell you the number of times my law partner and I would walk out of a room after having just met with Mark and whisper to ourselves, so where do we stand on this? Are we getting what we want? We would have no idea. In fact, one of my favorite memories is, for those of you who know Pocatello, there's a place called Cafe Toscano. It's really a gas station that they added a restaurant to, but the food is really good. And you'll hear people on the phone inviting friends, say, oh yeah, come on up here to Cafe Toscano. Yes, it's in a gas station. Yeah, come. So it's a great place to go have dinner. We went up there to have a meal with Mark and talk about a case. And it was my law partner's first time meeting Mark. And I told Joel, I said, look, we're going to have this conversation. At some point, he's going to say or do something that's just going to throw you off. You just got to work through it. And, we'll figure it out. Just be aware of it. We got through the whole meal. It was great. Good conversation, negotiations. And I thought, well, okay, I guess I was wrong. And Joel's going to tell me what was that about. He was so, easy to work with on this. As we got ready to go, Mark said, well, do you want dessert? Well, I wasn't eating dessert, but Joel said he'd take some. And Mark ordered one dessert with 2 spoons. And I sat and watched my partner share an ice cream sundae with Mark and I. And he looked over at me like, what am I supposed to do? Mark knew how to get to people. He'll go down in Bannock County history as one of our greats, and we've had some great ones from Bannock County. Darrell Manning, Herman McDevitt, his brother Chuck, Patty McDermott, Chick Bilyeu, Diane Bilyeu, Burt Marley, Ralph Lacey, and the list goes on. Mark belongs in that group. Mark was loved by Pocatello because he was good to people. No matter your station in life, no matter your political party, your position on issues. Yes, he was a great attorney, he was a great statesman, but the characteristics that meant and mean the most to the people of Pocatello were his kindness to others. He treated people with respect, and that's how I hope you'll remember him. That and having dessert with my partner.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Engelking, you have the floor.
Thank you. I had the privilege of sitting next to Mark, not only here on the floor, but in JFAC for over 4 years. And it was interesting because I actually had a little more seniority in that committee, so we get to pick our chairs when we first come in, and I was one of the first one to pick, but Mark was a negotiator, and he quickly said, we need that chair right there. You need that chair right there. And I said, right by the door. And I said, I do. And he said, yep. And so I took that chair, put my stuff down, and then quickly afterwards, when he got his, he sat right next to me and he said, now we need to switch. So he ended up with my seat by the door, and I was happy to give it to him. And if you guys have had a chance to be around Mark very often, you would know that he's constantly sketching and he's writing little notes, and not a day went by that I didn't get one of these sketches or one of these notes, and sometimes it was pretty hard not to burst out laughing when we were having a serious debate, but he just had this way about him of making you feel so important. He used to say, I'm your wingman. And I said, in reality, I was his. He was just a remarkable person, kind of bigger than life. I'd known of him before I really knew him. And I will tell you, one of his greatest joys was serving in this body. He loved this building, and he loved all who served with him. I will miss his sketches, his wit, his stories, his insights, and I know that he will be with us forever. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lakey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senators, it's my pleasure to stand up and talk a little bit about Senator Mark Nye. myself. He was a gentleman and a friend. He was always level-headed and professional. I loved his dry sense of humor. That's already been described. And typically, we called each other by our first names. But occasionally, we would come up to each other and say, "Counselor," and both of us would have a little bit of a smirk on our face because we knew we were probably going to be talking about some kind of legal issue. But we went into it with that respective smile on our face. And Senator was really a kind of a less used third option between Mark and I. We really had, as I look at it, a friendship. As was already stated, Mark and his firm is a foundation of the legal community in Pocatello, and he's known and respected statewide. I always appreciated his legal background and experience. And if he had a concern or a question, it would never started with, "Todd, you're crazy," or "Todd, you're wrong." It was, "Todd, have you ever thought about this?" Or, "Todd, what do you think about that?" He was really good at recognizing strengths and weaknesses in bills, even particularly his own. But although we come from different political persuasions, and as lawyers sometimes do, we agreed and we disagreed. But Mark was always a gentleman, a professional, a statesman, and a friend.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rice, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Senators, for the last 4 years, Senator and I served on the tax committee that I chaired. We didn't agree much on tax policy, but Senator Nye was always respectful. He didn't disrupt the committee. He'd make his arguments about bills. He loved to drop in a comment about what it did to or for Pocatello. And I loved his sense of humor. But I want to point out something else about Mark that I don't think has been brought up. His determination and dedication to serving those that elected him. I watched last year as he struggled, but he was here. He worked hard. He understood what we were talking about in the bills. He didn't sit back. He wasn't just here going through a difficult experience. He was here in spite of what he was going through and how he felt to serve, because he loved the people he served. And that's something that I think all of us should take and make more part of our nature as we serve, in whether it's in the Senate or where we've gone next. Remember, we serve. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stinnett, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you up there. Senators, I guess I was here for quite some time in this seat, so you'll give me the opportunity to speak about a very dear colleague. You know, after many years of memorializing a lot of our esteemed colleagues, we most commonly remember them for the quality of the character of the person they are and the integrity of who they are. I know that we spend a lot of time talking about issues and debating things, but you will notice, for those who haven't had the opportunity, that most often what you've heard about is really who they are. How did they touch us? Did they share in our struggles and joys? Did they make us laugh? The thing about Senator Nye, as you've heard from our dear colleagues, is that he did have an illustrious career as an attorney and guided a large firm. And he was a strong supporter of the Idaho State University. He would never deny that. He'd make it really clear to everybody all the time. And he was determined to work for his constituents, as Senator Rice mentioned, and local governments. Oftentimes he'd come to me and he'd say, "But my mayor needs this." Sometimes against my wishes, but he was stubborn about it. And that's the way he should have been. That's how we represent our people. But even though he spent quite a bit of time out debating and an extraordinary orator in the courtroom, he really didn't stand up and debate very much on the floor of the Senate. He was a very keen observer. And as was mentioned, usually I'd get the doodles that were the numbers, which made no sense to me. She'd get the pictures, and he would come back and go, "Did you hear this? And did you notice that?" And always be observing something that I did not even see. But it was very helpful just to have somebody who didn't have to stand up and talk all the time, who was very sure of his place on the floor, and that he was willing to work with anybody, and he really tried to understand all of his colleagues. So he really did speak only when he felt very deeply about something, and it was pretty short, but he wanted to make sure that he was heard when it really mattered. He was very quick with numbers, like I mentioned, and he thought out of the box, sometimes so far out of the box, I didn't quite follow it, but usually the thread would come around and I would catch the clue. He is a very dry wit, as was mentioned. I mean, really dry wit. And he was very well-traveled and super smart. And I always respected when he would make an observation about something. But as I mentioned, more importantly, I think that we remember him by is that he was always respectful, so incredibly loyal. He was very generous, wise, stoic, proud, sometimes reserved, very loved. And he cared deeply for everybody, his colleagues, particularly his family and his friends. He was a force, but he was a gentle soul. He is missed.
Is there any other senator that would like to speak on behalf of the late Senator Mark Nye?
Mr. President, or excuse me, Mr. Chair.
You have the floor, Senator Wintrow.
I just would like to say a few words. I started in the legislature with Senator Nye. We served on Judiciary and Rules together, and it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I loved Mark, and I think Mark loved me despite the fact that I'm from Boise. He made that very clear about Boise a lot. But I deeply miss Mark. Mark loved his family and was so proud of Alex and all his kids and grandkids. And when I first met Eva, it was clear that she was the star of the family, and he was clear about why. And that just always impressed me about the love that he showed always. He's one of the smartest people I know. And when we'd sit down in committee, what took me a night to study, he would sit down, take his pencil, and start circling things on the page, and in an instant knew exactly how he was going to vote or the question he was going to ask or how he was going to back somebody into a corner if he needed to. And many times, I would have to remind him that we were on camera. Because as you well know, Mark's dry sense of humor, he got by with a lot of things, and I told him, Mark, you can get by with all this. You're a smart attorney. Just by association, you better be calmer. And he would laugh and just keep going. And the thing that I think is funniest about Mark, and I used to tell him this, I said, number one, between him, Wendy Jaquit, and Cherie Buckner-Webb, they must know the entire state. And the other thing about Mark is I used to tell him, if I had a dime for every time he had to declare Rule 39H, because he had sued the state, and most times won, I would be a rich woman. He was always declaring a conflict because his law firm was helping so many people. And I can remember having many lunches with Mark. He always liked to take us to the Arid Club, and he loved to take all the interns and everyone he could. And we would have some of the most delightful and fun conversations. And one time I learned that he'd actually met the Queen. Mark himself was royalty. And the last thing I remember about Mark is, like everybody has said, he loved serving and he loved kids. And when kids came into the State House, he loved that. And he loved to bring them to his desk and take them on a tour. And I can remember one day we actually went to one of my schools because they had invited me to speak. And I said, Mark, come along. He had a ball. He loved kids. And he loved to just really open the door for kids to know their government and to be accessible. I'll never, ever forget that love of kids that he had. I miss Mark a lot, and I know everyone that knows him misses him tons, but he left an indelible mark in our legislature, and I just want to thank his family for being here and for sharing him with the entire world.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Cook, you have the floor.
Thank you. My first term, I drew the short end of the stick, I guess you could say, but I was the last one to pick an office, and I ended up in the wonderful Democrat office, bullpen. And some of those Democrats would get me wound up as tight as a kite, but Senator Nye, it was always wonderful to go sit in his office and just talk to him. And it was so relaxing, and it was, we didn't talk politics, we just talked. I think that the funnest thing I remember about Senator Nye is he was on JFAC with me, and he sat next to Senator Ward Engle-King. And I don't know if the acoustics were just right, but whenever he whispered, it sounded like he was yelling. And so there was no secret between Senator Nye and Senator Ward Engle-King in JFAC. But I just really grew to love Senator Nye and the calming spirit that he had. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Guthrie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opening remarks from the senator from 29. And I can tell you, I was in the room on the chamber call when he found out he was running for the Senate, and he may have disguised it with what he said on the call, but his face could not hide his surprise. So that was classic Mark Nye doing that. When you're Republican and Democrat, which Mark and I shared that relationship, him being a Democrat and me a Republican, and our districts being in proximity to each other, you might say that along the way, and I know this is a shock to some of you, there occurs a time to time healthy tension that happens. And we were at a Rotary event speaking, and they had two different perspectives. So they had a Democrat and a Republican speak, and Mark took a little shot at me. And so afterward, I went up to him and I said, "Hey, buddy, what's going on here?" And he just kind of smiled that little grin of his, and to the senator from 29 and others' point, he was messing with me. And he had this sense of humor, and we've heard about it being dry. And how dry was it? Well, it was Kansas Dust Bowl need a respirator dry, let me tell you. But it's through that interaction with him that I learned his mannerisms, I learned his sense of humor, and I think I grew to respect him. I know I did. I think he maybe grew to respect me a little bit, and we became friends. And I think the thing that if I could say three things that really represent Mark Nye as far as my observations: his love of community, his love of education, particularly ISU, and his love of his wife, Eva. And I really grew to respect her as well. She's such a sweetheart and such a good family. And appreciate the opportunity to share a few remarks. And hopefully, because of that relationship, that interaction, I've become in some ways a better senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Groh, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to share a couple of thoughts regarding Senator Mark Nye. As you look around this room, you see all folks of all different ages, some that are very young and some that are not so young. And Mark and I came in about the same time frame. He had a long, distinguished career, professional career, but he always had the goal of participating in the legislature. And because of it, my career as a CPA in tax season, it made it impossible for me, really, to be here, but I always wanted to be here. And so I think we had a special camaraderie because of that. We were together for 4 years in the Local Government Taxation Committee. He sat behind me in JFAC for 4 years, and he would often on break or even whisper while we were from behind, he'd say, "Scott, you need to run a bill about this." And there'd be some offbeat bill that he knew nobody would ever vote for. I said, "No, Mark, I think you should do it." And so we had that kind of repartee that would go back and forth. But the thing I remember, after this distinguished career, here's a Harvard guy, and all the things he had done, and known across the state as a distinguished lawyer, one of the renowned in this state, that he would think that being here in this body was something he would want to aspire to and go to in his old age. And so I hope that each of us, as we think about that, think about the honor it is to be here, the sacred trust that it is to be here, think of those that have gone before us, and that Mark Nye is an epitome of a gentleman that always treated everyone as a gentleman and as a lady, and that we are here, and he was here, because he loved Idaho, and he loved the people of Idaho, and let's all remember that as we go forward. I honor Mark Nye for his great service. Thank you.
Is there any other senator that would speak about the late Senator Mark Nye? Seeing none, the chair recognizes Senator Ruchti to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My initial reaction is to rebut some of these nice things that were said about Mark. When you follow somebody into a position like this, all the nice things you hear, you can't help but to wonder whether there's more disappointment who followed him than who was in the seat before. But I know Mark would love hearing these things about himself. He's such a wonderful person. Appreciate everything and all the nice things that were said. Glad that his family and friends were able to join us for this and hear just how sincerely we will miss him and how much we love him. And with that, debate is closed. Thank you.
Thank you. The debate is closed. Will the family members of the late Senator Nye please stand to be recognized?